Hey guys, welcome back to Choosing Recovery. I'm Olivia.
I'm Scotty.
Today we have a story from Jay, so let's go ahead and jump into it.
Zoom.
Yep, what were your drugs of choice and at what age did you start using?
How long do we have? So, my struggle actually started with prescription pills, but not opioids. And so that's a story that doesn't get told a lot. And I'm not special. This isn't an unusual story. But most of the time when someone's talking about prescription pills, they talk about opioids or they talk about painkillers, all these kind of things. Mine were antipsychotics and benzodiazepines. And it was because of a misdiagnosis in my teenage years. So I was given the diagnosis of bipolar disorder. That was not accurate. And quickly became addicted to all of that medication. Now, on that, I felt so terrible on a day-to-day basis that to just exist, I was smoking a lot of cannabis because it was like the only thing that made me feel better. If your base level is normally down here and then it raises to here, if you want to party, if you want to do something on top of that, having a drink or doing something other people do it's not going to work. And so by the end, I was doing a good amount of cocaine. If I wanted to get out of my head, which by the end I was wanting to do a lot because I was really miserable feeling the way I felt, I was taking a lot of psilocybin, doing a lot of shrooms to try to just leave behind this existence I was living in. So there was a lot of that. I went to music festivals a lot, so there was a lot of Molly. Oh man, what else was I like? You name a thing. Oh, DMT. I was doing a lot of DMT at the end. I did acid a bunch of times, and I only tripped once, so I kind of gave that up. But basically, what I tell people is that the only drugs I didn't do were meth and heroin. If you have another drug, I at least tried it once.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So what age did you start using any substance?
So I was diagnosed with ADHD at 11. So that was the first time I started taking substances, was these prescriptions. And now we know that the way drugs affect the brain, our brains do not differentiate between a good substance and a bad substance in that way. So of course, my ADHD medication was better for me than as an 11-year-old if I was snorting a lot of cocaine. But the way it impacted my brain is very similar.
Yeah.
And so that is why I ended up getting this diagnosis of bipolar disorder, because when you take teenager who's going through puberty, and we all remember what that was like, you then add to it someone like me who has low levels of mental health struggles, especially at that time, bipolar, depression, anxiety. I've had OCD my whole life. And then you add on top of that brain-altering chemicals, well, some shit's gonna happen. And my therapist saw this perfect storm that he helped create and instead labeled it something else. So that's where my misdiagnosis comes from. So 11 is when I first started, and then soon after that, I'm already taking some stuff. I'm like, why not try some other things? So, started smoking for the first time in middle school before giving it up in high school. I was an athlete, and I wanted to be as focused as I could. And of course, here I am being like, I'm not going to smoke or drink because I'm being focused, and then taking 10 times that in prescription pills every day. So I didn't do any of that stuff in high school other than my pills. But in middle school, I experimented a lot and then started again. The minute I was done with baseball, which was my main sport, senior year of high school, I immediately started doing all this stuff again because I was like, there was my reason to not do all of this. Right. I'm going to go have fun.
Yeah.
I think it's huge that you are touching base on the misdiagnosis, because it seems too often that even with young kids, like you said, with our hormones and everything are unbalanced, and we're just getting into puberty and everything like that, and too often doctors do shove diagnosis and medication down children's throat, and it's very important to touch base on that because of how misdiagnosed can dangerously impact your life.
And we're so big on telling people to get educated on addiction, get educated on your children, on what they're going through. Like this little shit they teach people in school nowadays, it's nothing.
They're barely touching the surface of really what in depth it could be touching on. So I love that you.
Yeah, I thought I'd never heard a story of someone starting younger than I was. And 11 is real young. But unfortunately, a couple of years ago, a buddy of mine sat down with me over lunch, and he had said, the reason I wanted to chat was the school just recommended I put my son on ADHD medication. And I know that you have a lot of experience around that. And his son was 7, and I was just like, dude, that's like downright criminal, you know.
He's 7.
Now, by the way, I have to specify this. I'm not this anti-drug crusader, right? I do think for a lot of people, these pills can be crazy helpful. I certainly, by the time I was in middle school, I wouldn't have graduated high school without this help. Now, that being said, there are alternatives, and starting me on it at 11 is just dangerous. It is just dangerous, considering we know what that will do to a young person's brain. And especially, to your point that they don't teach about these things, we know that if one parent struggled from some form of addiction, you're 5 times more likely to struggle as a child. If both parents struggled with that, you're 9 times more likely. You're basically guaranteed to struggle with addiction. So they didn't teach me this. Now, neither one of my parents are classical addicts or struggle with that in the classical sense, but they both have what we would call the addictive personality, right? So you take that, then you put little Jay at 11 years old on medication. You might as well have given me the big book for my 12th birthday. I mean, it was going to happen, you know? And they didn't teach me this stuff. They just said, here you go, kid, have fun.
Absolutely. It's definitely important to be educated on all surface and pass that on to your children as best as you can, right? Because we can only do so much, but it's a fact of like trying to go against it. So how long did you use for?
So I answer that question by saying that I think my problem years were 19 to 23. I obviously, like I said, I was on medication throughout middle school and high school. But as I said, I didn't use anything in high school. And when I graduated high school was when I started using again, and also when my therapist really started doubling down on this idea that I had bipolar disorder and had to be treated. So that is sort of the starting point of my danger years, and that would have been my freshman and sophomore years of college, and then I failed out, and then it was 2 years after that. Now, after I got into recovery, I was sober for about a year, and then I started incorporating certain things back into my environment again. I've never incorporated prescription pills back in. I mean, I'm on, antibiotics right now. I'm not counting that, but things like, painkillers, even though that wasn't my vice, I don't mess with prescription pills. Maybe I would be fine, maybe I wouldn't. It's not worthy for me to find out. Luckily for me, I never had an issue with alcohol, so I've always been able to drink safely, other than, as a college student, misusing it like every college student does, but I never had an addiction to alcohol. I'm a very big proponent of cannabis. I love CBD. It's a big part of my regimen. Not in the way of I wake up and I have to take this, like when I was struggling with my misuse, but in the way that I take vitamins. I've been taking mushroom pills lately, which are really cool. It's not magic mushrooms. I wish it was magic mushrooms, but just mushroom pills. This is a new company that swears by this, and this pill has 10 different mushroom strains in it, and I actually feel I have more energy when I've been taking these. My body feels like it's running cleaner. So all of that, I'm really interested in using plants to feel better after using, non-plants and sort of man-made chemicals and stuff to feel good for a long time. So that's a big part of my regimen in terms of CBD and the like.
So who did your addiction affect?
Yeah, I would say everybody in my life to some extent. Obviously me first and foremost, and that's something I work with clients on as a coach is recognizing we hear, those of us who struggled, if you're struggling now, those like us who used to, we always are told what it did to other people, right? Everyone is so quick to be like, let me tell you how it's affecting me. And those can be helpful. Many times they're not. Many times, I had one client whose mother was hell-bent on shaming him into recovery. And I wanted to shake her and be like, this will not work. Stop it. Just stop. But first and foremost, you have to recognize what it's doing to you, right? Because that is the only way that you find a reason to want to get better. It's easy to keep kidding yourself about other people, but if you can recognize what it's doing to you, that's when you go, okay, I need to make at least some positive improvements. So number one was me. Number two definitely was my family. It was the kind of thing when I was in the lockdown unit after attempting suicide and overdosing, that like I had family members come visit me, and that's a really shitty thing to do. Not to them, like they wanted to be there, but like it was not fun. It wasn't like they were visiting me in college or something. They were visiting me in a place where I didn't have shoelaces in my shoes and I wasn't allowed a belt. That's not a good place to visit people. So definitely my family seeing me that way. There were friends who I lost touch with. There were friends that I hurt along the way. I honestly don't think that there were many people in my life that it did not affect in some way.
Absolutely. I remember when I went to jail, my grandmother came to visit me. And how embarrassing the fact that like I was in stripes and I was, like 90 pounds soaking wet. And she sat on the other side of the glass from me and just talked to me. And I'm like, what the fuck, Olivia? What the fuck? Your 80-year-old grandma's just...
What grandma was
Hello,
that?
Judy. Oh my gosh. I was like, okay, here we are, It does, but I think it's important that you touch base on yourself because you are that important. There are things that have affected you in your own, and a lot of people, like you said, dismiss that. And that's, come on, you're the main character,
Yeah.
So... Yeah, and that's such an important thing to say in terms of remembering that... So this is something else that we kind of... Our society is super focused on how we relate to others, and that's super important too.
Right.
Forget at times, it's like my younger brother just got married, and they asked me to send, it was over Zoom and all this kind of stuff, and they asked me to send my words to be read at the ceremony. And I said, may you two always remember that you come second to yourselves. We get this love story that's like, put them first before you. That's ridiculous. You can't, why is it in the airplane that they tell you put the mask on yourself before you help someone else? Because you can't help them if you're passed out.
I love
remember, and that is my love message to everybody is don't put them before yourself. Remember, you can't be the perfect partner unless you're healthy yourself. So put yourself first and then put that other person on immediately after you.
Absolutely.
And that's why we think it's so important too, because a lot of people are like, oh, you're both in recovery. We met each other with time under our belt, but we're we always say we are not each other's recovery.
No.
Whatever happened to either two of us, that would not determine our own fate. We have our own recovery before we have each other, and that's seriously the most important thing because there comes challenges with being with somebody in recovery, there is that, well, what if, but that's where you need to determine for yourself of who you are, what you're capable of and what you're going to do, because that's what it really comes down to at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So
100%.
Well, what led you to get clean?
So I entered recovery in 2010. So in 2009, summer of 2009, I attempted suicide twice. On the second time, I overdosed, and I got arrested because that's what our country does to people who are struggling with their mental health. Yep. The last thing I remember that day, friends of mine called 911, and a cop showed up, handcuffed me, threw me into the side of his car, and then tossed me in the backseat. And I blacked out on the way to the hospital. Next thing I know, I wake up, I'm handcuffed to a bed, go out again, come back, and it's like a movie scene where my sort of consciousness zooms back in, and I'm in the intake room of this lockdown facility a day later. And I look around, I come to and I go, where the fuck am I? And they're like, you've been here a while. I'm like, I have no memory of getting here. Where the hell am I? Mm-hmm. And so I'm at this hospital, and I'm spending 3 weeks there. Get released to my parents, who then send me to what we would have called a mental institution 50 years ago. Now we call it long-term care facility, whatever your euphemism is. And I spent 3 months there. Mm. And it was there that I started to meet people with both bipolar disorder and struggles with substance misuse and addiction. And I started going, hold up. My experience does not look like that. It does look like this. Is it possible that that's really what's going on? And my in-house therapist there, conferred with my therapist back home, and they were like, no, they're pretty sure you have bipolar. I'm like, but that what I'm presenting doesn't look like this, right? And in the years since, I've actually gotten his notes. I opened records, requested my own everything from everything from CVS, my prescribing records, to this long-term care facility, and his notes are full of doubts. He's going, this guy doesn't have bipolar. I have no idea what's going on here. But he was so stuck on sort of agreeing with the other therapist that the only way he would agree with me to get off of my medication was if I agreed to get off of everything and then start over with new medication. And I said, I don't want to do that. I want to try just being without anything. And he said no. So luckily for me, I was there against my will, but I wasn't court ordered. And so I applied for release. They couldn't keep me. They weren't allowed to. And I was released to my own recognizance. I went to live with my grandmother in a small town outside of Sedona, Arizona called Cornville. And in Cornville, I spent almost 4 months going through step-down detox. For those of you listening or watching not familiar, if I tried to go cold turkey, I was on so many different medications that the combined withdrawal would have literally killed me. So it took me almost 4 months to take a little bit less every couple of days until I was finally off of every medication. And that was when I entered recovery. As I said, I went completely sober, like beyond the AA definition. I didn't have coffee. I didn't have nothing for the first 6 months. And then I welcomed cannabis back into my life because I was doing good things for me. And I didn't drink for the first, I think, year to a year and a half. Maybe a drink, like to celebrate. I don't have any memories of drinking. And then that was when I started to sort of welcome everything back in. So I don't have a date. I do have a period, and that was the spring of 2010. Then what recovery looked like to me was kind of constantly changing after that.
Yeah. So how are you staying clean today?
Well, as I mentioned, it depends on whose definition, you're talking to. I don't use the word clean because that word's got a lot of meaning to it for some people. It's got a lot of negative baggage for a lot of people. For me, when I say I'm in recovery, what that means to me is that I'm in a healthy place as opposed to now 11 years ago when I entered recovery in 2010. And a lot of that is no prescription pills. Like I said, I could be fine. I don't know. I'm not willing to risk it. But for me, the biggest things are mindfulness, number one. I practice mindfulness every day. I honestly believe it's been a game changer and a lifesaver for me. I truly believe in what Johann Hari said, who wrote the book Chasing the Scream. If you haven't had a chance to read that, it's incredible, about the history of the drug war in this country and around the world, and how we don't understand addiction and all this. And he said the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. And I 100% believe that. I'm in a much better place, period, than I was 10 years ago, 11 years ago. And while I 100% could get knocked off that pedestal by a drug or by a bad whatever, fill in the blank, for some people that's sex, gambling, whatever the case is, it's a lot harder because I'm much more stable than I was, back when I started struggling at 19. So I think a big part of it is living more fully, being aware of the life I live, being thankful, being grateful. I have a wonderful wife who is a great life partner. And just being more fulfilled with my day-to-day, which allows me to do something like, drink safely, have cannabis in my life in a healthy way. Those are pretty much it. I definitely, I'm not out there shooting heroin going, no, everything's fine. And I'm sure, there are people that can use heroin safely. I don't think I'd be one of them, but, to each their own.
Absolutely. So what is your biggest accomplishment within your recovery so far?
So I always say that there's 2 days in everybody's recovery. The day they enter and the day they start talking about it. We are taught by the biggest elephant in the room, AA, that, it's literally in the name, to be anonymous. And now 100 years ago, when they first started, there was a reason for that. People have feared losing their job, their livelihood, all that kind of stuff. That was 100 years ago. We know a lot more about addiction now. We know a lot more about substance misuse. We know a lot more about why the attitudes around these things existed and sadly still exist. The stigma is very real. And we are in a position to challenge that now, that those people, I actually think they were in a position, but I understand why they didn't 100 years ago. So for me, that day was election night of 2015. I was invited to give a talk at a thing called Cincy Stories. I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio, and there was this organization called Cincy Stories where they invite influential or well-known Cincinnatians to give their origin story. And he asked me to tell mine, and I was like, "You are fucking out of your mind. That is never going to happen." And it took him months and 3 times of asking before I finally started considering it. And then I listened to some other people in my life who gave me good advice and finally agreed to do it. So I gave that talk on the election night 2015, and that started this ball rolling. And now here I am, going on 6 years later, of doing this first on the side, and then full time for the last 2+ years.
Awesome.
So I think that is something that a lot of people never feel comfortable doing, is talking about their own struggles. So I am, number one, very cognizant of not only that accomplishment for myself that I got there, but also the privilege that I have of being someone with a platform and can talk about these things safely. I'm not going to lose my livelihood if I talk about the fact that I used to struggle with substances,
Absolutely.
that I've had mental health struggles, all this kind of stuff. But other people would. And so I definitely recognize that privilege. But I also encourage people to be aware of where they can, safely discuss these things. Maybe it's not getting up on a stage or doing it as a full-time thing like I do. But maybe it just means telling your partner. Or if your partner is the kind of person who thinks terribly about addicts and all this ridiculous shit, talking to your friends, talking to your family, whoever isn't going to turn their back on you. That's how we break down these stigmas. That's how we advance these issues, is by all doing this in whatever way we can. It can't just be a couple of people. It's got to be everybody changing this narrative.
Absolutely. We have a huge thing on TikTok, and it's called Recovering Out Loud, because it's breaking the silence, right? Like, we all have to put in our part and share our stories, because that's important to show other people that, it's not this, like, you're not the only one struggling in it, right? Would you change anything knowing what you know now? Like, from when you're...
100%. So 2 things that I say all the time when I get interviewed. Number one, if I could go back to tell my parents when I was in middle school and first being recommended to get on these medications, and then being given the diagnosis a couple of years later of bipolar, it would be get a second opinion. When it comes to physical health, we get 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th opinions, right? My aunt is currently fighting cancer every step of the way. She's had 4 or 5 doctors weighing in. Why is it that first, when I got this life-changing diagnosis of ADHD and was put on medication, but then when I was given the equivalent of mental health cancer, being told I had bipolar disorder, which is a very serious diagnosis, we just said, well, you're the doctor, you know best, and we didn't get a second opinion. So, number one, get a second opinion. It doesn't have to be awkward. Go find another therapist and say, hi, we've never worked together before. My doctor just gave me this pretty heavy diagnosis. I would love to get your opinion on that. So that's number one. Number 2 is, I can't say this enough. When I was at my worst, I truly didn't believe that there was anybody that was there for me, and that's what led to my suicide attempt. So reach out. There is always people in your life who will listen. And I know that when you're at your worst, you can convince yourself otherwise. Like I literally did that myself. But I will tell you this: 1, you're wrong. But 2, if you truly feel that way, find me. Go to my website, jschiffman.com. I've had people, honestly, this is no joke, I had someone reach out over TikTok and was just like, hey, thanks for posting this stuff. Can I ask you a question? Now, I recognize that's their way of saying, hey, I need to talk about this thing. But to them, they just wanted to ask me a question. We had a chat. It was very nice. Reach out. I will be there to talk to you. And we have a saying, those of us who do this work, and that is, we'd rather spend 2 hours talking to you today than 2 hours at your funeral tomorrow. So please reach out.
Wow. That's deep. I haven't heard that.
It is deep.
Wow. That's really good. So what would you say to somebody that's still out there actively using?
Yeah, I would say that number one, times are changing. I was at a conference right before COVID. Literally, actually, the woman who was running the COVID response for South Carolina, where I currently live, was in this conference, and like I knew her, and she kept ducking out to take calls because it had just hit the state the day before. So that's how it was, like a year ago, and the entire 2-day conference, the only mentions of sort of the AA 12-step style of recovery came in the question and answer sessions. Now, nobody there would say that those things don't work. What they would say is that the days of that being the only answer for people struggling are not only over, they're way over. There are so many other options now, from smart recovery to, I love, there's a guy out in California who started a completely new program named D. Jaffe. His is called Ignited Recovery. You know, these are groups that are trying to add the greatest thing about 12-step is the group. It's the people who are there to love you, to support you. But there's also a lot of outdated thinking in 12-step. So people that it doesn't work for didn't have other options. Well, now there are these other groups that you can go to if you're on buprenorphine. You can go to if you want to practice harm reduction, which is, you know, say you're using heroin in an unsafe way. Well, maybe start using clean needles. Maybe you start going to, you know, testing your drugs to make sure it's not, you know, anything else, anything terrible like rat poison and fentanyl and all these things that are killing people, right? If you tried to be in a group that supported that, AA would kick you out the door, whereas some of these other groups are okay with that as long as you're trying to use in a more safe way. I was talking to, again, to D. Jaffe, who started the Ignited series out in California, and he was telling the story about a woman who literally was on one of their group calls at her dealer's house while she was, you know, heating up some heroin, and that was okay with them because she was making positive steps. And so instead of saying, nope, you got to wait until you're completely sober to come to these groups, it was helping her take those steps. And now here she is 5 years later, and she's completely in recovery, doesn't use heroin at all. So it's these things that it's like, let's support people in a way that helps them get there, instead of saying you got to get there on your own until you can come into this group. So that's what I would say, is that there are other options. Look for people on Facebook, look for people on Reddit. You know, there are communities that will support you using more safely. You don't have to go completely cold turkey or run the risk of all this kind of stuff. Find people who will help you use more safely and help you walk that path to a safer place.
That was much needed to be said. We're huge on individual. People are individualized. You lived a different life. You lived a different story. How you handle things may be different from how I do, right? Like, what works for me is not going to work for you. And we always say that. There are so many, if it doesn't work for you, find what does. It's a great thing about recovery. You learn who you are, you learn what works, you learn what doesn't, and then you get to grow and move on from there. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think that's the most important thing. It really is. I so agree with that.
Yeah, I like the individuality piece, and I think it's also easier for me to say that as someone who didn't use AA. I went to 2 AA meetings in my life. The first one was when I first tried to get into recovery in Arizona. Here I am going through Step Down, and I go to this room that are a bunch of old dudes getting, have been off of alcohol for years, and then me, 20, 30 years old, going through Step Down detox, and they were basically like, "What the fuck are you doing here, kid?" So that helped me go, all right, well, I guess I got to find another path, right? And being that person who's now 11 years in recovery without AA means when someone tells me, well, this is the only way to do it, I can say, you're literally wrong, and I am proof of that. I'm sitting right here. And I've gotten some of that BS of, oh, well, you're the exception. It's like, no, I'm not, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, everybody has a different path. I literally had a woman, I gave a speech before, I don't know, like 50, 60 people, right? And she called me afterwards in tears, and it was this incredible conversation about how, she didn't tell people she's in recovery, all this kind of stuff. And then we get towards the end, she goes, now I have to tell you one thing before we go. I am very scared for your future. And I said, why is that? And she said, well, you don't go to AA, and I just truly believe you can't stay in recovery without AA. And I was like, as someone who's 10 years in recovery, my fingers are crossed that you're wrong, but I'll let you know. So, people get stuck in these ideas that their way is the only way. And I've had people in AA on my podcast. I've had people that are still using. My only answer is you can come on as long as you don't use the word only. Everything else is fine. If you say your way works, that's great, as long as you say it's not the only way.
Absolutely. I love that. That's so important. It really is so important. Everybody's different. You just got to find what works for you. So if you could say something to a family member of a loved one that suffers an active addiction, what would you say to the family member?
So I mentioned this earlier, but there was someone I was working with, a client who the mom actually hired me. That was so weird about this situation. I get approached by moms all the time, and the first rule is like, you have to listen to what I say, even if you are just like revolting against it. Trust me that I know better than you do. Now, I don't know everything. I'm gonna make mistakes. I guarantee you, though, I know better than you. You are in a raw emotional spot. I've done all the research on this. You know, I know what I'm doing. I appreciate your opinion. You have to know I know better. She said, fine. I'm working with her son, and while we're working together, she was cleaning his room because he had moved back in with her, and she pulled out his dresser to get behind her or something. I don't even know. Found a needle. Now, he told me later that he didn't even know that was there. Like, that had fallen years before. It was stuck behind his dresser, whatever. She flipped out and kicked him out of the house. I won't have you using in my house, all this kind of stuff. Now, here's a guy who's young. He had overdosed not long before, and that's why the mom reached out to me. He was, at this point, like 2 weeks in recovery on buprenorphine, which costs money. And now he has nowhere to go. He's out of his buprenorphine. He's on the street. What's he gonna do?
Yeah.
We all know the answer there, right? We all know heroin's $10 down the street from him, right?
Right.
He's gonna go buy a bag of heroin. 100% of the time, that person is gonna go buy a bag of heroin. And what did he do? He went and bought a bag of heroin and he relapsed. So he and I still work together, and I was able to help him now get back up on his feet again. But I did that by telling him, your mother was wrong. She screwed that up. That was not your fault.
Good.
And she could not hear that. Now, later, he told me that she called him and apologized, which is wonderful. But she could not see in that moment that was a direct result of her doing this poorly. So I would say to all of the parents listening, think about the consequences of your actions. If you truly want your child to be safe, if you truly want this person that you love, remember that you love them. And don't do something that is going to have the unintended consequence that is almost guaranteed. If you kick that person out and they are not in a safe spot, they're going to go back to what makes them feel good, and that's the drug. So do not kick people out. I get it that it's stressful on you, and I tell every parent I work with, find a therapist for you. It's not like, put that aside for a second. What you're going through is trauma, and you need to treat that trauma. Your son, your daughter, whoever does too. But that is a separate issue. For you, find someone to be there for you to treat that trauma.
Absolutely.
So that when something like this happens, you don't kick them out and guarantee that they're going to relapse. Yeah. You have a therapist to call and say, what do I do? I'm freaking out. Help me through this.
Yep.
So those are, I guess, my two. Number one, remember you love the person. And two, take care of yourself like you're a person going through trauma, because you are as well.
Absolutely. Very good knowledge to give. Absolutely. So we are just going to open the floor, Jay, to whatever you feel is necessary to share.
So, well, first off, thank you for giving this opportunity. This was a lot of fun. You have good questions. I would say that the final thing that I like to talk about when I get these opportunities is to help people understand where our thinking around drugs and addiction comes from. And the sad thing is, while the government and a lot of these sort of just say no and sensible drug policy people crusade against this, the origins of this are so clear if you take the time to look. In fact, a lot of the initial drug laws were outright racist. It says it in the law that one of the first drug laws in this country ever passed, the Harrison Act of 1912, was overtly racist against smokable opium. And it wasn't because they thought it was more dangerous. It was because that was the kind that was preferred by Chinese immigrants. It is out in all of the arguments around this drug law was that this was the kind that degenerates used, right? There was a fervor that gripped this country in the 19-teens that decided that there were hordes of black Southern men who were taking cocaine and were impenetrable to bullets. Now, we hear that now. We say that's fucking ridiculous, right? Yeah. Here's the sad thing. Police departments carry a very heavy gun to this day that they started carrying in 1917, or it might have been in 1913, based on this idea that the guns they were carrying before could not bring down a black person on cocaine. These things have real life consequences that stick around to this day.
Wow.
So, the next time that you think of a person struggling with an addiction as a degenerate, know that you were supposed to think that way. That was the way this was created back in the 1910s, 1920s. We were taught this because the people who organized the first drug laws in this country wanted us to fear immigrants. They wanted us to fear black people. They wanted us to fear Mexicans. It's outright open. So as much as the government and all these people can have done this work to try to crusade against these ideas, unfortunately for them, the history is all very open. And a lot of, again, go back to Johann Hari's book, Chasing the Scream, where he goes back through all these laws. This was a bestseller, by the way. It's not exactly hidden history. All of this is out there. But it's hard to compete against these ideas that have been taught to us. I mean, we're all the same age. We were taught DARE in school. And we knew that stuff didn't work. Just Say No did not work. It harmed more than it helped. But it was easier for the government to do stuff like that than to admit, yeah, we've kind of been treading on these racist ideas for now at this point almost 100 years. So know that these ideas are not new. They're not, they didn't come from nowhere. They were created for a reason, and that reason was racism, sexism, and downright bigotry. Know that the next time you think of someone struggling with addiction as a degenerate.
Awesome.
Wow, that's definitely something. I'm gonna look up that book and I'm gonna tag it down below as well as all your social information, because I think that's really important to look at. That's huge. I honestly, I didn't know that. That's a lot of history, and it's a lot of, sounds like a very important information to know. So
we like to think that the war on drugs started with Richard Nixon. Some people even say Ronald Reagan in 1980. The fact is, it actually started right around the turn of the century in the early 1900s. Those guys just made it more political. There was a person that's almost been lost to history. Everybody knows the name of J. Edgar Hoover, but at the same time as J. Edgar Hoover, he had a best friend that worked in government with him. Hoover was focused on, all the sort of civil rights and all that kind of stuff that he was doing horrible things around. But his counterpart was a guy named Harry Anslinger. And Harry Anslinger led the U.S.'s response to Prohibition. And when Prohibition ended, he needed a new thing to focus on. So he decided he was going to focus on drugs. Now, he did this because he was openly racist. He hated black people. He hated Mexicans. He was well known for this. He went on the floor of the Congress and said that the reason he was doing this is because, in his words, marijuana makes black people think they're as good as the white men. That is his quote.
Wow.
And what's so sad about that is that the laws that he came up with are the ones that are still in the books today. So all of these go back to one guy, which was building on already some racist shit that was going on. That person was openly racist. He made up all these lies about Mexican immigrants. He came up with the word marijuana. It was not called that before he invented this word to make people afraid of Mexican immigrants. So we can trace this history. And people think that these ideas are true, that they're novel, that they know what's best. No, actually what you know was a very well-taught propaganda that's been around for over 100 years. So I don't get mad at people when they think these things, because we were all lied to that way. We was taught in schools. What I do say is try to challenge those ideas for a second. My story, you can call me a degenerate because I was an addict. My doctor got me addicted as a teenager. I didn't make that choice. It wasn't like I was smoking reefers under the, all that ridiculous shit. My doctor made me an addict. So these ideas that we hold are very easy to poke holes into, but on a grand scale, we still hear this shit all the time. Joe Biden called weed a gateway drug not long ago. What a ridiculous, outdated, it's legal in half the country. You know what I mean? So these things are still around. Knowing the history helps you understand how ridiculous they are. This is Jay Schiffman. I am been in recovery since the April of 2010. I don't know my actual date. And I would say the thing I'm most grateful for is the opportunity to connect with people like y'all who are doing this work. We need more hands on deck. We need everybody telling their stories. And the more people that we can influence, the better it's going to be for everybody that comes after us. So thank you.
Thank